Now we can talk about the heart structure. So when it comes down to it, we have 4 chambers in the heart, 2 upper ones and 2 lower ones. The upper chambers are where blood enters the heart, whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. These are called the atria. Atriums are resounding receiving chambers when you think about it outside of heart context. So an atria is a receiving chamber for events and performances that are going to happen. Ventricles are going to be the lower chambers. This is the area that's going to receive blood from the atria and then shoot it elsewhere, either into the lungs or not into the lungs directly, I should say, to the lungs so that we can supply that blood with oxygen, or to the rest of the body to supply the rest of the body with oxygen. And we have this septum. The septum is going to be a dividing spot. So it divides the heart into left and right sides. We have an interatrial septum and we have an interventricular septum dividing our sides of the heart. So interatrial septum and interventricular septum. Each side has 1 atrium and 1 ventricle, right? We have 4 chambers. 1 atria on the left, 1 on the right. 1 ventricle on the left, 1 on the right. So when we're looking at our hearts, we can start trying to look for identifying features. We're going to identify things based on the way that the blood is moving. So the blood enters the heart initially when it's deoxygenated via the vena cava. So our vena cava are going to be entering the heart from the bottom and the top. So but they enter the same chamber here. All right, this right atrium. So we're coloring them blue here because they're deoxygenated blood. So we have inferior vena cava coming up from the bottom of the body and the superior vena cava coming up from the top. And they both enter this right atrium. Now, before we discuss the atrium, let's discuss something on the outside so that we know what we're looking at. These are called auricles. These auricles are what cover the outside of the heart. They're these muscular flaps, if you will, on the outside of the atria. So on the outside of the right atrium, which we just identified, the inferior vena cava, or the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava entering, the right auricle covers that right atrium, and the left auricle covers the left atrium. So when we have those inferior and superior vena cavas entering the right atrium, colored orange here, our right auricle would be on the outside covering this. We have this cut in half right now, but if it wasn't cut in half, we'd have the right auricle on top. From the atrium, from this right atrium, we have this arrow going down. Well, it's going through this structure called a valve. This valve is separating the right atrium and the right ventricle. That valve allows blood to enter from the right atrium to the right ventricle, but not back. It prevents the blood from going backwards. So it moves one way. The right atrioventricular valve allows blood to enter from the atrium to the right ventricle. It's called atrioventricular, combining the atrium to ventricle. And you can always remember that we're going from an atrium to a ventricle based on the nomenclature here. So atrioventricular. Atrio is first, meaning atrium, and then the ventricle. Atrioventricular valve, allowing blood flow in one direction. From our right ventricle, so we have our blood in the right ventricle at this point. It's deoxygenated coming from the inferior and superior vena cavas into the right atrium and then the right ventricle. So from our right ventricle, we can go into what's known as the pulmonary trunk or the pulmonary artery. This is taking that deoxygenated blood and moving it to the lungs, hence pulmonary. Whenever you hear the word pulmonary, you should be thinking the lungs. The pulmonary artery or trunk is going to send via these smaller pulmonary arteries. We have 4 of them. Deoxygenated blood to the lungs to be supplied with oxygen. They leave the right ventricle via the pulmonary valve. Can't go backwards. So we're going to the lungs from the right ventricle. It's got to be pulmonary, lungs, pulmonary valve. All right, so we got supplied with oxygen at the lungs. Now what? That comes back to the heart. These are called veins. Any structures coming back to the heart are veins. So these are going to be bringing the oxygenated blood back from the lungs to the heart. These are the only oxygenated veins in the body. The only deoxygenated arteries in the body are the pulmonary arteries. So that's a good question for you to focus on, especially for lecture. Not all veins are deoxygenated, and not all arteries are oxygenated. When it comes to the pulmonary circuit, it's the vice versa, but that's the only time. So now we got oxygenated blood coming back into the heart via the pulmonary veins. Where do they end up? Just like what we're talking about for our receiving chamber on the right side, now we're just coming on the left side into the left atrium. So those pulmonary veins come into the left atrium, colored green here. If we didn't have this cut in half, we would see an auricle on the outside of this left atrium, the left auricle. But we have it cut in half, so we go from our left atrium into our left ventricle via the left atrioventricular valve. So atria, ventricle, atrioventricular valve. All right, so get that straight. Are we on the left side? Are we on the right side? Are we in the atrium? Are we in the ventricle? We always go from an atrium to a ventricle via the atrioventricular valve. All right, it just depends on if we're on the left or the right side. And now you can see this arrow is going back out to this other structure here. So we go from the left ventricle into the aorta. All right, well, we're going from the left ventricle into the aorta, so we have to be going from a valve. So the valve, this aortic valve going into the aorta, prevents backflow from the left ventricle back into the ventricle or back into the atrium, right? So this aortic valve is preventing backflow. So the aorta is going to have a ton of pressure, so it's ending up being the largest blood vessel in the body. This left ventricle is going to be a lot larger than the right ventricle. You got to think about it this way. This left ventricle needs to be able to pump so hard that it pumps the blood all the way to your toes, and then have enough pressure to be coming back up. So that aorta is going to need to withstand a lot of that pressure, so it's going to be huge. Hence, it's the largest blood vessel in the body, your aorta. And your left ventricle is always going to be meatier than the right ventricle. So you can see with us cut it in half here, we have a lot more meat on the left side than on the right side. A lot more myocardium over here, which we'll get to shortly. And now we can talk about our coverings and tissue layers. So, our heart is enclosed in that double-walled sac called the pericardium. All right, so we kind of went over that already. When it comes down to it, our outermost layer is called the epicardium. You have a really nice picture of this in your lab printout that I have for you. The epicardium is the outer surface of the myocardium, which is the middle layer. So we have all in red here is the myocardium. The outer layer is this black epicardium. It's very small, very thin, just connecting it to the pericardial wall, which is the visceral pericardium. And then our endocardium is the inner surface of the myocardium, so it's kind of what these ridges are here. This endocardium is continuous with our blood vessels. So like our aorta, this is all endocardium and lining the inside of the blood vessels that end up going throughout all of our body as well. Alrighty. And I think that actually is it. So if you have any questions on this, I have some supplementary review material in the lab folder itself. This is a pretty loaded lab. Think about it this way though. After this, everything is downhill for the rest of this semester. This is one of the hardest labs. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of physiology going on for lecture at the same time as this physiology or this anatomy stuff going on for lab. Take it slow. Utilize your resources like the Learning Center. Email me if you have questions. Kate is a great source, Kate O'Grady. But otherwise, please have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll chat soon.